First, I want to welcome everyone from the BSA and thank you for coming here for what I hope will prove to be an interesting day. But I was supposed to participate in a congressional hearing today and had not expected to be here this morning. Wasn't expecting to be here until the afternoon. But over the weekend, the Office of Management and Budget sent out a directive to all departments, essentially saying that we should not be participating in hearings until after the full budget for the administration for FY18 comes out. So I am here. We didn't rearrange the schedule for the meeting because it was on such short notice, so that the director's report is going to be after the executive session at 1 o'clock this afternoon, as in the program. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I first would like to thank the BSA for their really constructive input this morning on the various proposals, because it's exactly the kind of advice that we are looking for. And I look forward to your continuing to do that this afternoon with the proposals that we have this afternoon. We have a three-part presentation for the acting director's report this afternoon. I will make some opening remarks, and then Jim Dorshow is going to talk primarily about the virtual formulary and the match trial, and then Dina Singer is going to talk about the Moonshot, which, as you all know, has been funded, and how we are in the process of currently implementing it, and going forward, how we plan to implement the funds from the Cancer Moonshot. We are continuing to strongly move forward, and I want to tell you about a couple of recent visits from the leadership. From first that Tom Cole's subcommittee, he's the chairman of the House Subcommittee on Appropriations. They came out here in January and spent more than 3 hours here visiting. There were Democrats, Republicans, and Chairman Cole talked about the unity of the committee, and I think that they were very favorably impressed by what they saw at the clinical center. In the area of cancer, we had a presentation on prostate cancer that was oriented towards directed imaging, and there was a patient who had had a small increase in his PSA several years ago, but multiple blind biopsies had been inconclusive, and so using an experimental approach that was being developed in the clinical center through NCI, they did directed biopsies which identified invasive prostate cancer, which was treated locally, and he is doing very well now 5 years out. And I should point out that the technology, which at that time was experimental, has now been commercialized and is being disseminated and utilized in a number of different areas. And the interest on the part of the members of the subcommittee was really very strong in that area. Last month, Secretary Tom Price, 10 days after he was confirmed by the Senate as Secretary of Health and Human Services, came out here for a shorter amount of time. But once again, the NCI was something that he was shown at the clinical center. In this instance, it was a patient of Dr. Steve Rosenberg, a 51-year-old woman who about a year and a half ago had metastatic breast cancer and had exhausted all forms of standard treatment. And so first her tumor received genomic sequencing, and then T cells that responded to some of the neoantigens that were identified through the sequencing, they were essentially identified, selected, and grown up. And she was then treated with those cells after immunodepletion. And she now is more than a year out and essentially cancer-free. And Dr. Price, as a practicing orthopedist, could not help but be impressed at this. Obviously, it is an anecdote in that it is one patient, but these are the kinds of advances that we really think can be made much more commonplace as we go forward with more research. Dina is going to talk with you about the Moonshot, but I just want to point out that for FY17, there are $300 million coming to the NCI, and we are planning to make very good use of that funding to fund new research, some of which and basically all of the RFAs you have approved either in the past or one of them you have recommended today. The appropriation for FY18 came out last week from the Office of Management and Budget, and I just want to point out that the NIH appropriation was just that. It was a proposal, and nothing was said about the distribution, etc. So it's very early days for thinking about what the FY18 appropriation actually will end up being. Instead, I think we should continue to focus on the FY17 appropriation, where we are in a continuing resolution through April 28th, and the major question seems to be whether there will be a full year continuing resolution or whether there will be some kind of omnibus appropriation. And I just want to remind you that last year the Senate subcommittee that is in charge of our appropriation recommended a $2 billion increase for the NIH, and the House subcommittee that does our appropriation recommended a $1.25 billion increase. And Chairman Cole has said publicly that he would like for the House subcommittee to get as close as possible to the Senate mark. Needless to say, this is an evolving story, and we need to stay tuned. But I just want to reiterate for everyone how important our regular appropriation is. It's not just that it is many times larger than the Cancer Moonshot appropriation, but also that it funds different kinds of research. And I just want to highlight a few. One of them is true investigator-initiated research. And this is something that we have been strongly supporting throughout, but especially in the last 3 years, we have increased the funding for Type 1 and Type 2 awards, going from about $400 million a year to about $500 million a year in the RPG awards. And as I have mentioned several times, most recently at the joint board meeting back in September, these substantial increases in the face of very limited NCI budget increases means that we need to find quite a bit of money in order to be able to fully fund the Type 5 awards, because we need, for example, when you've had a $100 million increase for the type 1 and type 2 awards, you need to have a concomitant increase in for the type 5 awards, the non-competing awards, in order to fully fund those areas. But it's not just a financial issue, but I just want to emphasize the extreme importance of investigator-initiated research. The second area that I want to talk about is training. The training of young people is absolutely essential for the future of our research area, and needless to say, for the future of biomedical research. And nothing would bring the best people into this area like a sustained increase to the NIH budget appropriation. And I think that the appropriation subcommittees clearly understand that, but if that doesn't happen, the ability to recruit, train, and retain the best people to go into this area risks being jeopardized. And then the third area that I want to talk about are some of our special projects. For example, the RAS initiative, which has this hub and spoke model through Frederick National Laboratories, as well as extramurally, Dave Tuvison has been a terrific advisor for the committee, but and Daphna has been involved. But this is a program that is a high-risk program, was recently reviewed by the Frederick National Laboratory Advisory Committee, and given a very positive review. Again, this is not part of the Cancer Moonshot. And then the last area I want to emphasize is the vast majority of our clinical trials are not part of the Moonshot, but instead they are supported through the regular appropriation. And one of those that you'll be hearing about from Jim momentarily is the match trial. So the bottom line is, my feeling is, we are continuing to move forward to make faster progress and to help our patients. With that, I would like to turn the podium over to Jim, who's going to talk with us about the formulary and match trial.
So great, thanks Doug, and thanks for the opportunity to update all of you on where we are on these two activities. Just to remind you, I've talked a little bit in the past about this project, which is about a year and a half, almost 2 years in the making, to develop what we call an NCI Virtual Formulary. So what is this and what is the problem we're trying to address? Well, as many of you know, those of you who do drug development in the laboratory and those who do early phase trials, it's not always easy. In fact, it's often very difficult to get hold of high quality compounds from pharmaceutical companies for use in your investigations, and in particular from two different companies with drugs that can be combined for either preclinical or clinical investigations. There are many issues related to the IP that might be developed, the issues related to how the companies would get the data from such studies, and clearly has been an obstacle, I've heard from many different cancer center directors, for individual cancer centers to implement their own precision medicine programs at their centers. And so we began this process of trying to develop and work with the pharmaceutical industry to develop a program in which the NCI would leverage many of the mechanisms it has to provide PIs with agents for investigator-initiated trials. And the idea is as follows. Really, this is no help unless it's something that where you get an answer fast. And we've set up an arrangement and an agreement with companies, I'll talk about that in a minute, in which you send in an LOI for one or more agents. We transmit those requests on a relatively short form to the companies that agreed to work with us. They've agreed to give a relatively rapid 6 to 8 week turnaround, up or down, as to whether they will supply drug either for a preclinical investigation or for a clinical trial. You would, if it's for a clinical trial, the investigators and the institutions, primarily the NCI designated cancer centers, would hold the INDs for these trials, but the NCI would function to A, facilitate review, and B, track the studies and make sure that the data for those studies are getting to the companies in an appropriate time. The reason this has been attractive to the companies who have signed on, and we continue to negotiate with several companies, is that for many years, upwards of a decade, the NCI pioneered in developing intellectual property agreements that allowed two companies to give us their compounds and allow individual, usually NCI designated cancer centers, but other centers as well, to combine those drugs under agreed upon IP terms. So this is something that is a known entity with respect to the IP risks if they exist. The agreements follow all of those previously negotiated kinds of activities, and really has been very, very well accepted by a number of companies. Our initial goal was to get 5 companies and 10 compounds. We launched the middle of January with 6 companies and 15 compounds. We now have another company and 11 more compounds. If you look at the list, some of these are really pretty early compounds across not only a wide variety of small molecule targets, but also a variety of immunotherapy targets from these companies. And so we're very interested in your accessing these reagents. The website, please, you have it on your slides. The process is not arduous, and I would like to put in a pitch that not only for the clinicians who want to do combination trials, but for investigators who I know you can all buy compounds from around the world for use in your laboratory. But I would suggest to you that sometimes perhaps the quality of what you get from a supplier outside the United States might not be precisely what you think it is. So that unless you do your own mass spec on every milligram of what you purchase, you may or may not know what you're testing. In this case, you would have access to drugs that are clinical grade drugs for use in the laboratory. They're approved by the FDA, and you know precisely what you're testing. So we would just like to encourage all of you and anyone who's listening to try to access these compounds. I don't think that there's going to be an issue with regard to supply, and the issue is, can we facilitate research in a variety of different ways. So now let me turn to an update on the MATCH trial. So again, as many of you know, this was launched in July, August of a year ago, and about a year and a half ago, with 10 treatment arms. And then the accrual was so fast that we had to take a pause in November. It was built into the trial to pause after the first 500 accruals. We paused when we thought we were at 500. There actually were 795 patients accrued. Looked at the rate of accrual, which was more than double what we had estimated it was going to be, and reopened with 24 arms in May of last year. What I'm here to report to you is that we're almost done. We are certainly in the home stretch. We're screening about 115 patients a week. So you can multiply 115 by 13, and you'll get to 6,000, which is where we are. We are funded to do 6,000 biopsies. We'll probably, no matter what we do, end up doing more than 6,000 because it turned out that in the week before the trial when it was known when the first pause was going to occur, there was just this enormous flood of patients who were registered. So we expect the same thing will happen when we get toward the end. But in fact, this is, I've said it before, I'll say it again, without doubt the most rapidly accruing study that the NCI has ever conducted. And the thing to point out is that, which I didn't take the time to emphasize in the last slide, is that this is going on at 90% of our community sites and 80% of our NCI designated cancer centers are participating. So as I said, the registrations are averaging about 115 a week. The assay success rate is very high. We're getting the results back to physicians, and we had hoped for a 2-week. The median is around 16 days for the return of results. So I think that is really about as good as anyone could expect, and certainly is as good as what happens in the commercial sector. So it's just some detailed information. If you can't see this, you have the slides that Doug asked me to go into in terms of a couple of issues that have been raised in the past. Because one of the initial concerns was, well, you're only going to accrue, breast, colon, lung, and prostate patients. It's going to just overwhelm the trial, and we won't get any patients with diseases that are not quite so common. So what you see on this slide is, sure, there are a lot of patients with breast and colon cancer who have been entered, but actually not so much with respect to prostate or lung. There are a surprising number of patients with uterine cancer, with ovarian cancer, with other diseases. And so this has really been very, I think it's outstanding, because we really want to be sure that if we're doing this screening and we're looking to try to find signals, because this is a signal finding trial, that we actually have the opportunity to look at a wide range of diseases to try to detect abnormalities, genetic abnormalities that might be of specific interest. What about the demographics? So there are several things on this slide that are of interest. It's not a surprise that more women than men have been screened. That's true for the entire NCI clinical trials program, that turns out to be the case. It's probably not a surprise in terms of there being an 80% Caucasian entry, but we have reasonable numbers. Could always do better for African Americans and for Hispanics. I think what is, I don't know if I can point to it or whether you see it, but it sure as heck surprised me that the youngest patient screened was 18 and the oldest was 100. And so there certainly is no age bias in terms of what's going on in the community in terms of having patients screened for this investigation. This also, I don't know if how well you can see this or not. It's also somewhat surprising. These are the state-by-state accrual. So it's not a surprise that California is at the top of the list, but it is a surprise, and I'm not going to make any value judgments about the numbers associated with any state, but you can find your own state and you can draw your own conclusion. There are some large states that are lower down on the list and some smaller states that are higher up on the list. I think I should probably just leave it with that. These are the original 24 arms. We're making very good progress toward finishing the accrual. I'll go into that in greater detail. But I wanted to tell you that an additional 6 arms were entered just about a week ago with more targets that will enhance the utility of the trial. So this is now, we're up to 30 arms for this study. And we have 7 that have met their accrual goals. Several of the arms are actually in an expansion phase. I can't tell you that I know for sure, because I don't. I should say I'm not allowed to know whether or not there's been any efficacy. But those of you who know a lot about clinical trials can guess that there are contingencies put into the trial for when you expand and when you don't. And again, if I say any more than that, I will, I'm sure, get into trouble. So I won't. There are, again, 4 more arms that are reaching they're near their accrual goals. And then I want to spend a minute at the end of this talk just talking about something that has been discussed for the better part of a year, and that is that there are, so yes, we're going to complete accrual for a large number of these arms on the trial. On the other hand, there are probably half dozen or more that target very rare mutations. And so a lot of thought has gone in across the board. Remember, this is being run by ECOG Akron, but we have an incredible group of between 100 and 200 volunteers, clinical trialists, drug developers, geneticists, who have met almost on a weekly basis to try to figure out which arms to choose, what drugs to, how to prioritize. There are very clear rules about what to prioritize. But the issue has been, what do we do? We would love to finish these trials with respect to the low mutation, because we might get an interesting signal. And so the decision has been made to implement over the next couple months a project with the 2 largest commercial purveyors of sequencing and 2 large cancer centers, MD Anderson and Memorial, and to investigate whether or not we can have patients directed to this trial based on the results of those commercial assays. This will involve our QCing the assays that are done by Foundation Medicine, done by MD Anderson, et cetera, making sure that we get the kind of concordance that we have already demonstrated in the 4 labs that currently do all of the sequencing. But this would, number one, allow us to continue the trial without because I think I've told you before, that the single largest expense are the biopsy costs. And if we can avoid the biopsies because they've already been done, paid for in a variety of other ways, and find patients that would help us finish these rare arms, it would not only would it help us finish this trial, but it would then set the stage for if there are going to be other trials like this. How do we go about utilizing information? I mean, there may be upwards or close to 100,000 patients who, from commercial sources, get their tumor sequenced in the coming year or two. It would be a shame to not be able to utilize that information, at least some of it, to facilitate our clinical trials program going forward. And we think that this initiative will allow us to do that. So I should stop and turn it over to
Thanks, Jim. Dina Singer will now go on and talk about the Moonshot and where we stand on that program.
Okay, so thank you. Just in the next few minutes, I'm going to very briefly summarize our implementation to date of the Cancer Moonshot Blue Ribbon Panel recommendations. As Jennifer Couch reminded you during her presentation, when then President Obama established the Cancer Moonshot, he outlined 3 major goals. One, and probably the most important, being to accelerate progress in our understanding of cancer from basic research through translational and clinical research to achieve, as he said, in 5 years what normally takes a decade. In addition, he encouraged greater collaboration and cooperation across the entire cancer community and was interested in enhancing data sharing. And we've taken all 3 of those goals to heart in our efforts to implement the Cancer Moonshot. In order to achieve those a Blue Ribbon Panel was organized with 28 members from across the continuum, as well as 7 working groups looking across, again, the cancer continuum for opportunities that could be accelerated, and many of you participated in some aspect of that. The Blue Ribbon Panel and the working group really looked to identify those scientific opportunities that were poised for acceleration and identified a series of recommendations that were then summarized in the report of the Blue Ribbon Panel. And those final recommendations, if you haven't seen them, are on the website listed there. The final report of the Blue Ribbon Panel was delivered to the NCAB back in September, but at that point, we had no funding to support the recommendations, and so it wasn't until the passage of the 21st Century Cures Bill back in the end of December that we were actually able to begin to implement those recommendations. The recommendations I've listed here, there were 10 that appeared in the actual report, and I'll remind you that we didn't assign letters to them, numbers to them. We assigned letters to avoid any misconception that we were prioritizing them. And we continue to find that very useful as we go forward, that these are all high priority recommendations as the process by which they were identified really culled to the most important and critical opportunities. I'll point out that in addition to the 10 recommendations, there were cross-cutting themes that emerged very clearly. One of them was health disparities, something that we're very attuned to. Prevention was another area, technology development, course, through all of the recommendations, you heard about that this morning, data sharing and partnerships. As I said, until the funding of the 21st Century Cures Act, which included a budget of $1.8 billion over 7 years for the Cancer Moonshot, we weren't able to do anything. The Cures Act specifically called out the first tranche of funding of $300 million for FY17, with subsequent allocations to be appropriated over the subsequent 6 years. So our efforts in implementation have really fallen into two parts. The first part is FY17, spending that as judiciously and quickly as we can, since the allocation was made in the middle of the fiscal year. And then the second part that I'll also talk about is our efforts on FY18 and 19. So in FY17, our focus has been to lay the groundwork for the larger efforts which will be launched in FY18 and 19. We were able to identify activities that were poised to be accelerated, that are foundational, as well as a number of pilots, so that in toto we are going to be able to fund a large number of initiatives that span at least 6 of the areas of recommendations, and I've listed them here. All of them are coming out as announcements, either as PAs, PARs, RFAs. For instance, you heard this morning the new enabling technologies, which is part of the FY17 Moonshot effort, other foundational efforts that will build on in FY18 and 19. So as I said, this represents a first thrust identifying or supporting 6 of the recommendations. So in FY18 and 19, we're going to have a much more structured process. In FY17, because of the timing of the allocation, we didn't have the opportunity to reach out even broadly across the NIH or to the community, which is what we're planning to do in 18 and 19. We want to have it, because of the scope and complexity of the recommendations, we recognize the importance of really having a very structured process that would allow us to get input from a wide variety of sources on how to best approach the recommendations. And so what I'm going to take you through is the process that we've outlined, and hope to convince you that this will be an effective process for implementing the recommendations. I'm going to start at the bottom here. Unfortunately, the pointer isn't strong enough. So the bottom squares represent the implementation teams. There are 10 of them, each aligned with one of the Blue Ribbon Panel recommendations. There were 10 recommendations. We have 12 teams because we assigned 2 teams to 2 of the recommendations. The immunotherapy translational network has 2 teams, one for adult and one for pediatric. The prevention and screening recommendation has 2 teams, one for prevention and one for high-risk screening. Each of the teams has is staffed by members of the NCI community, both intramural and extramural investigators. In addition, we have participants from the other NIH institutes that have an interest in the different areas of cancer. And in fact, we've invited them to collaborate with us, to participate on any of the initiatives that are coming out, and actually to help us co-fund some of those initiatives in an effort to actually extend our funds as far as possible. What Doug has offered up is that we will pay 2x for every X that another institute contributes. So there's an incentive for them to participate, but we do expect them to participate in funding as well. The implementation teams, I should note, we have a total of now over 250 people participating in toto in those 12 teams. The charge to those teams is to discuss the approaches and develop initiatives for FY18 and 19 that will achieve the goals of the recommendation. They are not to come up with new ideas. That was part of what the Blue Ribbon Panel and the working groups did, but to come up with the approaches to implement and achieve the goals. So it's a little bit different, but to look across the landscape of what we're funding, what can be accelerated right away, what needs to be filled in to achieve those goals. Importantly, because we have an opportunity for FY18-19 funding to look for input from others. Many of the groups are going back to members of the Blue Ribbon Panel or to the working groups, to advocates, to try to get input on the approaches that we should take. An important aspect of this is to identify partners. So in addition to the other institutes who we'd like to see collaborate with us, we'd like to reach more broadly to establish partnerships with academia, with foundations, even with the private sector, industry and pharma, et cetera. And I'll talk in a minute about a partnership committee that we have that is charged with really identifying those possible partnerships. Importantly, once those teams have developed their initiatives, we expect them to continue to work once the initiatives are funded, to manage those initiatives, to organize meetings, to monitor progress. This effort is going to be really a trans-NCI effort. It won't be housed in the divisions, it'll be housed in the teams, which will be responsible for managing them. So that's what the teams are doing. If we go up one notch to that implementation coordinating committee in blue, one of the challenges that we face and we realize we have to address is how do we communicate among all those teams? While we want them to function independently, we don't want them to function in isolation, and we think it's critical that there be a mechanism that brings representatives of those teams together to discuss the ideas that they've been working on, to find areas of intersection. It's very clear if you read through the recommendations that there's some that overlap and that we want them to take advantage of that to come up possibly with joint proposals as opposed to 12 individual proposals. So each team, in addition to having the co-leads, has what we're calling a coordinator, who is the representative of the team to that coordinating committee. By and large, those individuals also participated in the working group of the recommendation that they are implementing. And so they're representing not only the NCI NIH perspective, but also the working group perspective so that they can bring that to bear. The coordinating committee then has the opportunity to discuss all of the initiatives that are being proposed. They actually review them, provide suggestions on how to improve them if they need to be revised. Once they're approved, once the proposals, the concepts are approved by the coordinating committee, they then go to the implementation steering committee. But an important component of the coordinating committee is that we have a representative of the partnership committee. So I mentioned that we have a partnership committee that is charged with identifying areas of common interest outside of the NIH. One of the members there serves on the coordinating committee, and so very early on in the development of initiatives, we can begin to identify partners. All of this activity is really focused on the science, identifying the science and moving it forward. The implementation steering committee is responsible for looking at all the proposals in aggregate, looking at the budget, trying to integrate across all of that to finally come up with the suite of initiatives for FY18 and 19 that will then constitute the Moonshot. I should point out that the implementation teams have been meeting almost weekly. They're very actively engaged. The implementation coordinating committee has been meeting every other week. We've already reviewed something like 9 different proposals from 6 different implementation teams, so very rapid progress is being made. The steering committee is beginning to review those, and we hope at your next meeting we'll have many of those here for you to review and assess. And I'm happy to take any questions.